All right, so, diving in here, this time you sent us something, well, pretty fascinating, I gotta say. It's called Diet and Health by Lulu Hunt Peters. And get this, it was published way back in 1918. Talk about a blast from the past.
Absolutely. It's amazing to think about the world back then, the war, everything going on. And here's Lulu Hunt Peters, an AB, an MD, ex-chairman of the Public Health Committee, California Federation of Women's Clubs, Los Angeles District. It's a mouthful, right? But it gives you a sense of who she was.
It does. And she's got this distinct personality that comes through in the book, like the dedication by permission to Herbert Hoover. Now, that's a name you don't hear every day.
And let's not forget the illustrations, done by her, as she puts it. Small nephew, Dawson Hunt Perkins, the little rascal. I mean, come on, that's adorable.
It is. So our mission today, and this is what we always do, is to go deep, really deep into this book from like a century ago. Find those golden nuggets, those insights, those surprising bits about diet and health, those things that might still be relevant or at least make us think, huh, interesting.
Right. And Peters, she's very direct, very much a get to the point kind of person. She even gives you, the reader, some advice on how to tackle her book.
Oh, yeah, what was it? Something about headings, right?
Yeah, she says there's no one right way to read it. Sometimes headings first, sometimes the text, but always both because, as she puts it, they are clever. I wrote them myself. You got to love her confidence.
I do. And then there's this, well, almost a contradiction. She gives advice for both gaining and losing weight. I mean, in the same book.
I know, right? But she explains it beautifully. She believed that not knowing enough about food, like really understanding it, was the root cause of both problems, being too heavy and being too thin.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And you know what else is interesting? The story about the book's price.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. Apparently, she wanted a cheaper edition so more people could afford it, which is a noble thought.
Absolutely. But her publishers, they convinced her a higher price would make people value it more. She even compares it to her $10 fee for office advice, which, back then that was probably a good chunk of change.
It was. So basically, even back then, expert advice had a price tag. Okay, so let's get down to business. How about we start with how Peters defined what it meant to be at an ideal weight back in 1918? It's going to be different from what we use today, like BMI and all that.
Absolutely. And it was different. She had this very specific rule to find ideal adult net weight.
Oh, yeah, and it's pretty straightforward, actually. For every inch over 5 feet you were, you multiplied that by 5.5, and then you added 110 pounds.
So, for example, if you were 5'7".
Well, that's 7 inches over 5 feet, right? So you multiply 7 by 5.5, that's 38.5, and then add that to 110. So your ideal weight, according to Peters, would be 148.5 pounds.
Got it.
Yeah.
But what if you were, say, under 5 feet?
Aha, good question. The rule changes a bit there. If you were under 5 feet, you multiplied the inches you were under by 5.5, and then you subtracted that from 110.
Yeah.
Simple. Right.
Very height-centric. Okay, so let's talk about her views on being overweight.
Ooh, this is where things get interesting. She did not hold back, let me tell you. Especially given the context of 1918, World War I was happening, resources were scarce, everyone was being told to conserve, and she saw being overweight as, well, bad business is how she put it.
Strong words.
And the way she phrased it, imagine this, she compared fat individuals to people hoarding food in their bodies while the nation needed it.
Powerful.
Right, yeah. That really highlights the shift in how being overweight was viewed.
It does. Before it might have been something people kind of joked about, maybe even seen as a sign of prosperity in some circles. But now, with the war and all, it was like this shift towards distrust, suspicion, even aversion, as Peter says. Times were definitely changing, even in how people thought about weight. And she even addresses that feeling we all have sometimes, that frustration of eating very little and still gaining weight. She even mentions this Mrs. Natty B. Slim, who supposedly eats twice as much and stays thin.
It's that classic, it's not fair feeling, right? But Peters, she was very practical. She basically says she has the key to saving those who are struggling with weight, just like she did for herself and countless others.
Now that's a powerful claim. Which leads us to Peter's own personal struggle with her weight. She calls it a long, long battle, and even compares it to a moral struggle.
Absolutely. And she's surprisingly open about it. She talks about being heavier as a child, even though everyone kept saying she'd grow out of it. And then she shares that on her wedding day, she was, get this, a delicate slip of 165.
A delicate slip.
Okay.
So maybe not what we'd consider thin today.
Right. But for her time, it probably wasn't out of the ordinary.
And she even admits she's too embarrassed to say what her heaviest weight was. But she does tell us her normal weight was around 150 pounds. And at one point, she was 70 pounds heavier. That's a lot.
It is. And she's very honest about how her weight impacted her life. She felt it made her less efficient, less capable. As a hospital superintendent, she said she was only 65% efficient because of those extra pounds.
Wow, that's a pretty direct correlation she is making there. And then she does something pretty cool. She sets up this, meeting for discussion, a Q&A about weight.
It's a clever way to get to the heart of common questions people had, and her answers. Straightforward, no nonsense, just like her.
The first one is from Jolly Ms. Shisisite. Her husband apparently gifted her a set of Freet scales. Her question, why can thin people eat more and not gain weight?
Ah, the age-old question, right. So Peters has two main points. First, thin people are generally more active, so they burn off the calories. Makes sense. And second, get ready for this, she says thin people radiate 50% more heat per pound than fat people. She even calls fat people fireless cookers. Now picture that, if you will.
I'm trying to picture that. Fireless cookers, where'd that come from?
Well, back then, fireless cookers were a thing. They were like insulated containers, slow cooking with retained heat. So it kind of fits, right? Fat people holding on to energy like a fireless cooker holds on to heat.
Wow, that's an image. And she even talks about babies and children, saying the same basic principles apply. Okay, so next up is Mrs. Tiny Wayton. And her question, I'm guessing, is pretty relatable. We eat so little, yet we are fat.
And Peter's answer is classic Peter's. Yes, you eat too much. No matter how little it seems, if your body stores it away as fat, you're eating too much. Even if it's just one single bird seed a day, she's basically saying there's no escaping it. Food is the culprit when it comes to fat, period.
Tough love from Dr. Peters.
Yeah.
Then we have Mrs. Not Little asking about inheriting the tendency to be fat. Is it something you can't help?
Good question. And Peters is a little bit more nuanced here. She says, yes, there can be an inherited tendency. But, and this is important, she doesn't believe it means you can't do anything about it. It just means you have to work harder. She does distinguish between what she calls true fat, from overeating and not exercising enough, and fat from glandular issues, which she rightly says need a doctor's attention.
An important distinction for sure. And finally, we have Mrs. Ima Gobbler. Her question is something a lot of us who tried dieting can relate to. What's the use of dieting? I only get fatter when I stop.
Oh, I love Peter's answer here. She's got this playful exasperation in her voice. She says, you fat! You make me fatigued. You never diet long enough to get out of the fireless cooker class. If you did, you wouldn't.
She's not letting anyone off the hook. She's basically saying it's not about dieting. It's about a lifestyle change. Okay, so let's move on to the challenges of losing weight. Peters calls them the annoyances of reducing.
Yes. She actually lists some of the pushback she got or observed others getting. Like a husband saying he preferred her heavier. She even suspects that was jealousy talking, which, who knows, right?
Yeah. And then there's the sister who says she looks older when thinner.
And the friends who insist she looks fine or tell those, be careful, I knew someone who got sick after reducing stories. Those well-meaning but sometimes discouraging comments.
We've all heard those. It's amazing how some of those pressures are still around today. But Peters, she also talks about the positive side, what she calls the joys of reducing. What were those?
Well, one of the biggest joys, according to her, is that feeling of your clothes becoming looser, seeing your corset, and she specifically recommends a front lace corset for this actually getting smaller, and then, of course, having to take in seams, get new, smaller clothes. That must have been a big deal back then.
Clothes weren't as disposable as they are now, for sure. But she says don't alter those clothes too soon because loose clothing is like a public display of progress.
She also has some strong opinions about overweight people in tight clothing, saying they should be interned unless the garment is brand spanking new.
She doesn't hold back. And then she lays down her fundamental principle, food only. She truly believes that food and nothing else is the cause of being overweight.
Absolutely. She's adamant about that. And because she believed that so strongly, she warns against those dangerous anti-fat medicines. She even named some of the ingredients thyroid extract, arsenic, mercury. Scary stuff.
Wow, yeah, that's a reminder of how dangerous some of those old remedies were. She also says to stay away from drastic stuff like purging all the time or exercising too violently and those long Turkish baths. She's not a fan of those either.
No, not at all. She says they're not scientific and can cause more problems than they solve. So where does she go from there? Education, of course. She basically says, look, if food is the source of everything in your body, then you need to understand it.
Which brings us to a concept we're all familiar with today, the calorie. What did she explain it back then?
So she defines a calorie, and she uses the abbreviation C as a unit of heat and a unit of food value. It's the amount of heat needed to raise 1 pound of water by 4 degrees Fahrenheit.
We take that definition for granted today, but back then it was probably groundbreaking.
It probably was, and she even spells it out phonetically. Calorie, just in case anyone was unsure.
I love that attention to detail. But as you might imagine, not everyone was on board with this whole calorie thing.
Oh, absolutely. There were skeptics, people who called it all sorts of things. Foolish, a fallacy, a fetish.
Oh, critics. What were some of their arguments?
Well, one was that things like vitamins and mineral salts don't contain calories, so why bother with all this calorie counting? And then there was the classic, my grandfather never knew about calories and he lived to be 100. That one, she says, always made her mad.
I can see why. So how did she defend this concept of calorie knowledge?
Well, she's very logical about it. She points out that a calorie is just a unit of measurement, like a foot, a yard, a quart, a gallon. It's how we measure heat and the energy we get from food. And since food is so important, we need to know how to measure it.
Makes sense.
And she urges people to think in terms of calories of food rather than just say a slice of bread.
So instead of saying one slice of bread, you'd think 100 calories of bread.
Exactly. And instead of a piece of pie, you'd consider 350 calories of pie. It's about seeing food in a new way.
So how did they figure out the calorie content of food back then?
Okay, so get this. They use something called a bomb calorimeter.
A bomb calorimeter sounds intense.
It was. Basically, they'd put a dried sample of the food in this sealed chamber, which was then put into another container filled with water. They'd burn the food and measure how much the water temperature rose. The amount of heat it took to raise 1 pound of water by 4 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 1 calorie.
So basically, they were setting food on fire to figure out its energy content. Pretty clever, actually. And they thought that reflected what happened inside the body.
They did. They believed that food burned in the body, what they called oxidized, released about the same amount of heat as when it was burned in the calorimeter.
Interesting. So what were the calorie values she came up with? For fats, proteins, carbs, all that good stuff.
Well, she says fat has the most, about 275 calories per ounce when burned outside the body, which is about 255 calories in the body. Dry protein and dry carbohydrates, they're pretty similar, about 120 calories per ounce outside and around 113 in the body. She cites someone named Rose for these figures.
Makes sense that fat has the most calories. That's why it's so fattening, as she puts it.
Exactly. And she's careful to point out that while protein and carbohydrates have similar calorie counts, they're not interchangeable in what they do in the body. Protein builds and repairs tissues, and carbs can't do that. But fats and carbs, they can both be used as fuel.
Okay, so now for the big question. How many calories do we need each day? I'm guessing it varies, right?
It totally does. Peters emphasizes this. It depends on your age, your weight, and how active you are. Babies and growing kids, they need a lot because they're building new tissue. Then there are adults, and they mainly need energy and repair. And the elderly, they usually need even less because they're less active. And of course, overweight people, they already have energy stored, so their immediate needs are less.
Lots of factors to consider.
And then there's activity level. She gives this crazy example of lumbermen in Maine. Those guys could eat 5,000 to 8,000 calories a day.
Wow. That's a lot of food.
It is. But they were doing really hard physical labor, so it makes sense. And here's something interesting. Peters says mental work doesn't actually need extra food.
Really? I always thought thinking hard burned a lot of calories.
Nope. Peters says studies have shown that it doesn't. And in fact, she thinks overeating when you're doing mental work without physical exercise can actually make you less efficient.
Interesting. So what were the calorie ranges she recommended for different groups?
So for infants, she says 40 to 50 calories per pound of body weight each day. Growing children, about 30 to 40. Adults, depending on their activity level, need 15 to 20. And older adults, she suggests 15 or even less.
And any specific numbers for, say, children and adults, just to give people an idea?
Sure, for a child between 2 and 6, she says around 1,000 to 1,600 calories a day. For a child from 6 to 12, it's 1,600 to 2,500. And a young person, like 12 to 18, needs about 2,500 to 3,000. She also makes this general observation. A boy needs as much food as his father, and a girl needs as much as her mother.
Practical guidelines. And what about for adult men and women specifically?
Okay, so for men at rest, it's 1,800 to 2,000 calories. If they're doing sedentary work, it's 2,200 to 2,800. And for active labor, it's 3,500 to 4,000. For women at rest, it's 1,600 to 1,800. Sedentary occupations, 2,000 to 2,200. If they're on their feet a lot doing manual work, it's 2,200 to 2,500. And for jobs that require real strength, it's 2,500 to 3,000. These estimates come from Rose, by the way.
That's really helpful to have those categories. And she gives people a way to calculate their own needs too, right?
She does. It's a simple method. First, you figure out your normal or ideal weight using that height-based rule we talked about earlier. Then you multiply that weight by the number of calories you need per pound, which for adults is somewhere between 15 and 20, depending on how active you are.
So for instance, let's say your ideal weight is 150 pounds and you're not that active. What then?
Well, in that case, you would use 15 calories per pound because you're not very active. So 150 pounds times 15 calories equals 2,250 calories per day.
Makes sense. And what if you wanted to lose or gain weight? How do you adjust those numbers?
So to lose weight, Peters says you need to eat 500 to 1,000 calories less than your calculated needs.
To basically create a calorie deficit.
Exactly. She even gives you an idea of how much fat that would burn. A 500-calorie deficit is about 2 ounces of fat, which over a month is about 4 pounds of weight loss. And if you cut 1,000 calories, you could potentially lose 8 pounds a month.
Wow, that's pretty motivating.
It is. And for gaining weight, it's the opposite, of course. You gradually increase your intake by 500 to 1,000 calories above your maintenance level.
Okay, so now that we know how many calories we need, let's break down the food itself, the different classes of food, as Peters calls them. What you got to say about protein?
So protein, she says, makes up about 18% of our body weight. It's crucial for building and repairing tissues, giving us energy, and listen to this, it can even be stored as fat if you eat too much. And she recommends getting at least half of our protein from plants.
Half from plants.
Hmm.
Interesting. What are some good sources of protein, according to her?
Well, she lists a whole bunch. Eggs, all kinds of meat, fish, nuts, milk, cheese, the gluten and wheat, and all sorts of legumes, beans, peas, lentils, peanuts.
So there are plenty of options for protein, both animal and plant-based.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And she even gives you a sense of how much protein is in some common foods. One egg has about a 1/4 ounce of protein. Same for a glass of milk. 1.5 ounces of lean meat, fish or poultry, that's got about the same amount. 1 ounce of cheese from whole milk, about the same. 2 slices of bread, 3 heaping tablespoons of those canned, baked, or lima beans, 17 peanuts, all roughly the same amount of protein.
Wow, that's helpful. Okay, what about fats? Those have a bad reputation these days, but I'm guessing Peters has something to say about them.
Oh, she does. Fats, she says, they make up about 16% of our body weight, and they're primarily for energy. And, extra gets stored as fat. She divides them into animal fats, cream, butter, lard, and vegetable oils, cottonseed, olive, almond, peanut, walnut oil, even the fat in chocolate.
So fats are important for energy, but can lead to fat storage if you eat too much.
Mhm.
Pretty straightforward. What about carbohydrates? Those seem to be the enemy in a lot of modern diets.
Right. Well, Peter says carbohydrates, they make up a much smaller part of our body weight, just 1%, and they're also a source of energy and can be stored as fat. She breaks them down into sugars, candy, honey, syrup, sweet fruits, and starches, breads, cereals, potatoes, corn, legumes, nuts. And then there's vegetable fiber or cellulose, which is kind of in its own category.
So basically, sugars, starches, and fiber. We've got to have them all. What are things like minerals and water?
So, mineral matter, she says that's about 5% of our body weight, important stuff for bones, teeth, and all those essential bodily functions. She's a big advocate for whole grains, unpeeled potatoes, and cooking veggies, and just a little bit of water to keep those minerals in. And she even suggests saving that cooking water for soups and sauces.
Great tip. Waste not, want not. Right.
Exactly. And then there's water, which is like the big one, 60% of our body weight. Peters calls it the universal solvent, vital for everything. She recommends 3 to 5 pints a day.
3 to 5 pints. Got to stay hydrated. Any other advice on water?
Yeah, she says boil it if you're not sure if it's pure, and don't drink while you've got food in your mouth.
Good advice. Okay, what about those mysterious vitamins? I put that in quotes because the spelling's a little different back then.
I know, right? It's like stepping back in time. Peters calls them health preservers, and they're basically essential for growth and health. But here's the thing. Back in 1918, they didn't really know what they were made of chemically, but they knew they were important.
How did they figure that out if they didn't even know their chemical structure?
Well, through animal experiments, unfortunately. Peters even talks about this, acknowledges the benefit for human health, but then raises this ethical question. She actually asks, which is worth more, a baby's life or a guinea pig's happiness? A tough question even today.
It is. So where did people get these vitamins from?
She says they're mostly in the outer layers and germ of grains, and in fresh fruits and vegetables. They're also in fresh milk, butter, meat, and eggs. She even gives special advice for babies who are fed pasteurized or boiled milk, saying to start them on fruit juices and pureed vegetables early on to make sure they get those vitamins.
That makes sense. So we've got proteins, fats, carbs, minerals, vitamins, water. It's all about balance, right?
Exactly. Peters calls it a balanced diet, and she recommends about 10–15% of your calories from protein, maybe a bit more for children, 25–30% from fat, and 60–65% from carbohydrates. She even walks you through an example for a woman who needs about 2,500 calories a day, showing how that breaks down into actual food amounts.
So it's about understanding those proportions.
Yes, but she also reassures you that you don't need to be a mathematician to get it right. If your appetite's normal, your taste preferences will guide you, she says. Just make sure you get enough protein.
Intuitive eating almost a century ago.
I know, right? And she emphasizes that a balanced diet has foods from all the different groups, even those watery vegetables and fruits. They might be low in calories, but they've got those important minerals, vitamins, and cellulose, which she jokingly calls a daily scrub for the intestinal tract.
Speaking of intestinal tract, she talks about constipation too, right?
Yeah.
It's not the most glamorous topic, but it's important.
It is. She thinks the main culprit is a diet that's too concentrated, not enough roughage or fiber as we call it now. And for those who need a little help, she recommends agar-agar, a type of Japanese seaweed.
Agar. Interesting. I've never heard of that.
It's this amazing stuff, it can't be digested, but it absorbs tons of water, making things, well, move along more smoothly. She even suggests you can take it at night before breakfast or even as a substitute for afternoon tea.
A seaweed tea party. Okay, so she also mentions mineral oils.
She does, specifically refined paraffin oil. Not absorbed by the body, acts like a lubricant, but she's not a fan of using those physics, laxatives too often.
So basically a balanced diet with enough fiber, regular exercise, good bowel habits, and maybe some agar, or mineral oil if needed. Sounds like a plan.
It is. And here's a funny thing. She even links your disposition to constipation, saying that people with a sweet disposition are less likely to get constipated.
That's a good one. Okay, so what about food quality and moderation? I'm guessing those are important too.
Oh, absolutely. Peters has this core belief. Any food you eat beyond what your body needs for energy, growth, and repair, it's either going to be stored as fat or act as an irritant.
Or both, probably. So we've got to be mindful of what we eat and how much.
Exactly. She points out that foods high in fat and those that are dry tend to have more calories. She gives this great example. A concentrated amount of sugar has the same calories as a huge amount of lettuce.
Wow. So it's not just about how much you eat, but the type of food too.
Right. And she emphasizes that you don't need to be counting calories all the time, but you should understand which foods have more or less. And if you're trying to lose weight, overestimate your calorie intake. If you're trying to gain, underestimate.
Clever. Any other tips?
Yeah. She says weighing your food, especially at first, can be a good way to get a sense of portion sizes.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about eating a variety of foods? Why is that important?
Well, she believes that eating a mix of foods ensures you get all the different nutrients your body needs. She's not saying you have to eat a ton of different things at every meal, but you should vary your diet throughout the day. And she cautions against cutting out entire food groups, like carbs or fats, for long periods.
So no extreme diet.
Not according to Peters. And she's a big advocate for chewing your food thoroughly, what she calls thorough mastication.
Chewing. We all know we should do it, but do we really?
Right. She says if you chew well, you don't have to worry as much about food combinations. But if something consistently upsets your stomach, avoid it.
Good advice. And what about those little pick-me-ups, like coffee and tea? And what about alcohol?
So coffee and tea, she says they're fine in moderation, like most things. But alcohol, that's a no-no. She thinks it makes both thinness and fatness worse, and it's bad for your mental function, too.
No surprise there. Okay, so before we wrap up, she recommends some further reading, right?
She does. She's got a few favorites. The Home Dietitian, that's by her colleague, Dr. Billwood Comstock. She also suggests Feeding the Family by Mary Schwartz Rose and Dietary Computer by Pope. And she mentions free bulletins from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically Farmer's Bulletin number 142 by Atwater.
So lots of resources for people who wanted to learn more.
Absolutely. And she also lists other experts she consulted, like Lusk, Friedenwald, and Rura and Sherman. Shows you how thorough she was.
It does. Then she has this measuring table, which is basically all the standard fluid measurements used in cooking.
Exactly. So 1 teaspoon equals 1/6 of a fluid ounce. A dessert spoon is 1/3 of an ounce. A tablespoon is 1/2 of an ounce. And both an ordinary cup and an ordinary glass hold 8 fluid ounces.
Handy. And then comes the really fun part, the list of 100-calorie portions and average helpings. It's like an early calorie counting guide.
It is. She's got everything categorized: meats, fish, soups, dairy products and eggs, vegetables, fruits, bread and crackers, breakfast foods, candy, pastry, sweets, condiment sauces, nuts. You name it, she's got it.
So what are some examples? Like what was a 100-calorie portion back then?
Okay, so for instance, 1 ounce of that fancy tenderloin beef steak, that's about 100 calories. But you could have 3 ounces of lean round steak for the same amount. A small, crisp slice of bacon is just 25 calories, while a medium pork chop, depending on the fat, could be 160 to 300.
Wow, that's quite a range.
And then in dairy, 1 level tablespoon of butter, that's a full 100 calories, but 10 ounces of skim milk, also 100 calories. 1 large egg, about 100 calories too.
Okay, what about veggies?
Okay, get this. A whole pound of beets or carrots, that's about 100 calories. But only about 1.5 ounces of home-baked beans would be the same. And those potato chips, just 1 ounce for 100 calories.
Yikes. And fruit.
7 ounces of apple or fresh pineapple, that's 100 calories. But only 3 or 4 large dried dates. For bread, one average slice is usually around 100 calories, same as 3 graham crackers.
And what about the sweets?
Well, one medium chocolate cream candy is 100 calories. But a whole pound of chocolate, that's a whopping 2,880 calories.
No wonder they call it a treat. She even has mayonnaise and nuts.
She does. One medium tablespoon of mayo is 100 calories, and 10 large almonds are about the same.
Wow, that's a lot of detail. But then she gives us some key calorie portion reminders, right? Like a cheat sheet.
Exactly. So a piece of lean meat about 3 inches by 2 inches and half an inch thick, 2 ounces, is about 100 calories. A slice of white bread, 3 by 4.5 inch thick, also about 100 calories. One scant tablespoon of butter, 100 calories. One heaping teaspoon of sugar, 50 calories.